This podcast is produced by the team behind the Answered the Call, Australian History, How to Research, World War I, Australian Imperial Force Soldiers, 1914 to 1918 online course. If you're not sure where to start or find navigating websites confusing, this easy to use and practical online course will show you how to confidently research military sources, records, and more. Check out the course webinar at the hyperlink answeredthecall.mykajabi.com for the details of how you can reveal your family's fascinating military history. G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is Pete Smith, Battlefield Guide for Matt Mclachlan Battlefield Tours, and he has joined us today to talk about the AIF in 1918 and the costly battles as the Allies pushed for victory. Hi Pete, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Adam. What a fantastic introduction.
Pete, I'd like to start. So what were the key battles? Obviously, we've got the German Spring Offensive happens early in 1918, and what are the effects and what are the actions that happened because of the German Spring Offensive?
Yeah, well, obviously talking from an Australian perspective.
Yes, that's correct.
It is the most important year for Australia. There's so much going on. First of all, of course, what we have to do is stop that German Spring Offensive. And that's not going to be easy. And it's going to mean a lot of troops being moved around. And for Australia, of course, it means the coming together of all five divisions eventually around La Hamel, just prior to the action at La Hamel. Quite interestingly, a lot of people believe that at Villers-Bretonneux, for the fighting at Villers-Bretonneux on Anzac Day, that we have all of the five divisions there. We do not. The first division is still in France, in French Flanders, in fact, around the area around Strazil. So they are actually not part of that fighting at Villers-Bretonneux. But in holding the Germans at Villers-Bretonneux and not allowing them to get to Amiens, that is probably the most the key action in the defence of the defence of the line, because Amiens being such an important location. Of course, it's a railhead. There's canals, there's roads, there's depots, there's stores, and it's also command and control. It's the coming together of the French and the Empire forces. So again, if the Germans had managed to get to Amiens, it would have been a very different picture. I'm not saying, and I don't think anybody would say that the Germans would have necessarily won the war if they got to Amiens, or even if they got to the coast. They were massively overstretched. The German army was not being paid properly. They had no supplies reaching them, or very little supplies. They were attempting to live off the land. So it was the last roll of the dice. But they may have been in a very different position to try and call for an armistice if they'd been successful and had taken Amiens and perhaps had got to the coast. So there's a lot going on, and Australian troops very, very key in the area around Amiens in holding them at Villers-Bretonneux on Anzac Day. That's the reason why we commemorate that key fighting on Anzac Day here. And of course, and that is the odd thing. It is on Anzac Day that the fighting is taking place around Villers-Bretonneux. So we have a double whammy here, and the commemorations here have become very important. And as you know, are viewed on Australian television every year since they started in 2018. So it started in 2018, sorry, no, not 2018, 2008 is when the commemoration started there, and have been running ever since. So just over 10 years of commemorating Anzac Day here in a very, very important service at the National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux. So that's the most important thing. And then we have a little bit of a pause, of course. And we go on to the fighting at La Hamel, another key action on the Western Front. For reasons that are very obvious, it's going to be Monash taking charge of the Australian Corps. His first action, he has time to plan it, and that's the thing that very often people forget. We think that all of the planning is going to have lots of time and can be as well planned as Monash planned the fighting at La Hamel. But that's not the case. Because of that pause while we draw breath, while we reorganise, it allows Monash to have that luxury of organising the battle at Hamel. But it is important, very important, because of what he will bring to the battle. I don't want to make this into a conversation just about Monash, but he certainly, the detailed planning, the organising of the attack, that term that we use quite often for those of you that know anything about La Hamel, 90 minutes. It irritates me a little bit, because did the battle take 90 minutes? Well, of course it didn't. No, the battle went on beyond the 90 minutes, but effectively the key objectives were taken within that 90, I think we say 93 minutes it took. So it was 3 minutes out in his planning. It's just a way of saying effectively that he got it right, that the timings were right for that action. I'm probably seen not by everybody as the number one action at that period, and the Canadians under Curry were doing very well as well. But certainly Monash did something quite clever, and I've always felt this was quite clever. He wrote it up well, and a pamphlet was produced, a copy of which I have somewhere within my study here, which actually describes exactly what he's done. It meant that everybody can promulgate it up and down the front line. Whoever's interested can get a copy of what Monash did during the fighting at Hamel. So yeah, it's lots of changes taking place, and then we're ready after the fighting at La Hamel. We're ready for that 8th of August, and that's what we're going to be discussing here. The 8th of August, the Black Day for the German army, when we punch through their lines and basically continue then for 100 days, and that is what it is very often called. Peter Hatt wrote an excellent book on the 100 days, that pushing the Germans back until they have to call for an armistice. And not just the fighting that makes them call for an armistice, it is also starvation at home, the Navy mutinying. There's lots going on, but it is a crucial period, and certainly Monash is very much at the heart of that, involving commanding the whole Australian Corps. I think the crucial key here is a reducing in size, a corps which is reducing. So most of you will be aware of obviously the issue in Australia, no conscription. Issue in Australia, that's not a very good term. No conscription and referendum. And so what we have is we have a problem with recruits for the Australian Corps, and that will become serious as the fighting goes on within that 100 days.
I'm actually glad that you touched on that, because I was actually just about to ask how the strength of the battalions were up to the fighting of August the 8th, and obviously with the battalions being at what were their strengths, Pete? Like were they diminished from the days of Gallipoli, or?
Yeah, I mean the strength certainly had been on the wane. For those that are in the know, 1,000 men in a battalion, and that's what when I'm taking my tours. Generally speaking, I'm talking about battalions. A lot of the people on the tours have relatives who fought within those battalions, so that's what we generally speaking stick to. A battalion of 1,000 men. The next higher organisation is the Brigade, and there are 4 battalions in a brigade. So a battalion, 1,000 men at full strength. Well, almost never, even from day one, when Australians and this isn't just applicable to Australians, but all of the Empire's battalions are based on the same system. We're all using the same system. So 1,000 men in a battalion, but there are always men sick. There are men on course. There are men training. There are casualties that reduce the numbers. So we always have a reduced number. And I would say on average, probably 800, maybe 800 men available. And then, of course, what we have in an attack, you don't throw your whole battalion in, because you do not want to lose your whole battalion in one go. If something goes terribly wrong, then that's it. That's the battalion gone. So you keep a nucleus back, which may be 200 people, and sometimes it's some of the better people. You don't keep putting in your best men all the time. You give them a little bit of respite. So let's say that on a normal attack, you're probably going to be looking at maybe 600 or 700 men if it's a full battalion attack, maybe less, going into action. So what's the case when we have reduced numbers? And that is certainly after La Hamel, and as we go into this period of 100 days. And having said that, the Australian forces will not fight 100 days, because they are going to be withdrawn from the line on the 6th of October. Of course, the 100 days takes us to the 11th of November, the signing of the armistice. So the battalions were reducing it by numbers quite considerably. Not very many people enlisting, and in fact Australia had done several things over the previous year to try and encourage enlisting. They'd increased the maximum age, so it had gone from 38 to 42, and they thought, and they believed that would encourage perhaps some older people with a bit more experience to join up. They weren't being too careful on the younger chaps, and as we know, there were a lot of young guys joining up. And so, even though Australia had made a very big effort to try and stop young guys from enlisting by making sure that between 18 and 21, they had to have their parental permission. Now, no other country does that. Only Australia was the only country that tried to stop people joining up young by making sure they had parental permission. But people are still getting through underage soldiers. And so that will also be an issue. And the final thing that Australia did was allowed soldiers of mixed race to enlist. So in other words, the Aboriginal people who had been not allowed, they've not been allowed to join. Suddenly, if you're of mixed blood, then you can enlist. So that's a second thing they're doing to try and increase the numbers. The one thing that was good for Australian soldiers, and it's something that I always bring in as part of a joke when I'm guiding, is the fact that Australian soldiers were paid very well, 6 shillings a day, and a British soldier was only paid 1 shilling a day. So there was a big difference in pay, and that also helped with recruitment. At the beginning of the war, these things were put into place to encourage people to recruit. If you're not going to conscript, then you have to have people joining up for other reasons, and money being one of them. Obviously, being patriotic and king and country and empire, those were all part of it. Travel, experience, and money. So it does come into the overall reason why soldiers would enlist. But that's 1918. The numbers are still reducing. So let's think of the next big action after La Hamel. The next big action for Australian soldiers will be Mont St. Quentin. And some of those battalions going into action at Mont St. Quentin were going to action with 400 or less. So the numbers are getting critical, and yet they're still being tasked with a battalion task. So the battalion task is as if we were 1,000 men, 800 in the attack, 700 in the attack, but they're at half strength. So that's the thing that's important for Australia and difficult for Australia, is they are having to fight at half strength. Having said that, the same issues are connected with all of the Empire countries in 1918, and in fact Britain was bringing in the 18-year-olds. So 18-year-olds as they turn 18, then they are conscripted and off to the Western Front. So of course Britain has had conscription in since 1915. So it's been conscription for a long time. So manpower is an issue on the whole of the Western Front. The plus side of that, you would have to say, from an Australian perspective, if we are looking at the Australian battalions, is that means that the guys that are in the battalions are experienced. A lot of these guys, these 400 men in a battalion that's attacking at Mont St. Quentin or less, are guys that in the main have been there before. They've done it before. And there's a big advantage to that. If you know what's coming, then you can react to it. And generally speaking, a lot of the Australian battalions, and it's the same with all, there are good and there are bad, but a lot of the Australian battalions have a very good fighting quality in 1918, especially around Mont St. Quentin, which is a very tough battle.
So in your opinion, Pete, what made the Australians stand out from, say, their counterparts, the British, and what made them a crack fighting force in 1918 compared to when they got to the Western Front in 1916? What changed? What was it?
You have to be careful with this because I spend most of my time, about 90% of my time, is taking Australians around the battlefields, and certainly I have a bit of an Australian mentality now on the battlefields, and so you have to be careful in that you don't overblow it.
Absolutely,
using a British term, that we don't think the Australians are the cutting edge of everybody. Because the Canadians would be saying exactly the same, and the New Zealanders, even though they're only one division, would be saying, "Oh well, no, we were the shock troops. We were the guys that we used all the time." And in fact, everybody gets a fair crack at the whip. But what you tend to notice, and you do notice it, is that when Australians go into combat, it's very rare that at the end of that combat that they are back where they started. They generally, you generally feel that the action was successful and they are where they're supposed to be. Now, they may have taken heavy casualties, but they're generally speaking where they're supposed to be. So you have to say what is going on, and certainly the British military at the time was certainly aware that something was going on, and it's a little bit more complicated than you imagine. Yes, Australian troops were good, but yes, there were good British battalions and divisions. But there is something going on with, and it's the Australian mindset really. A British soldier certainly a British regular soldier, is very much constrained by the class system, by the regimental system, and the regimental system is all about obeying what you're told to do and making sure that you do to your best ability the job that you've been given to do. Now, what that means is that you don't deviate from the plan. So, if you're told you attack this X and you will attack from the front, then you continue to attack from the front. And the sad aspect of that is in a war with minimal communication, and that is the most important point. Minimal communication during combat, because we have no radio. We are using field telephones, which the cables are cut. We are trying to communicate with semaphore, using flags, standing up on top of a position and waving your flags to the rear. You don't survive very long. Interestingly, signallers at this time went into combat with the semaphore flag strapped to their bayonets. So they were being carried, but they certainly weren't being used. Flashing lights, they're using Morse, they're using lights, buzzers. They tried all sorts. But the radio invented and being used, and by 1918 being used quite successfully with aeroplanes, but still not robust enough for ground service, for use on the ground. And they were even trialing it in tanks. They were even trialing radios in tanks, but still not robust enough. So without communication, what you have to rely upon is people making decisions on the ground. And that's something that you have to say that the British Army, up until it is changing and we are catching up, but for a long time the British Army had problems with that because people felt they needed to talk to their superiors. They needed to look to their superiors for advice. Going back to Mont St. Quentin, Monash, who we know, detailed instructions for the fighting at La Hamel, so much detail it's almost mind-boggling. If you look at the instructions in the war diary, the battalions taking part in the Battle of La Hamel, then you look at the war diaries and the instructions from Monash for the fighting at Mont St. Quentin, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but Monash's orders were, you will take that, I don't care what it costs, but by tomorrow we have to have Mont St. Quentin taken. And for those listeners who are not aware, Mont St. Quentin is not some enormous great mountain. It is a little ridge, surrounded in some cases by ridges that are higher, but it's a very strategically important ridge protecting the town of Peronne. So it was so important to take it, but Monash didn't have time. This is the 100 days of movement every day. There is no time, as he had for La Hamel, to sit down and write out very detailed instructions, to look at every aspect of the fighting, which he does, to create an all-round attack. The other thing that we're having a problem with, and I'm drifting off on one of my...
No, it's great, Pete. Honestly, it's great. I'm happy. Yeah, go for it.
It happens all the time, as you that have been on tour with me will know. I often go drifting off. But tanks are obviously now crucial. Tanks part of the fighting in 1918, part of the 100 days. But there is a problem with tanks. We have no tank transporters other than the railways. The railways have to be reinstated to keep tanks up with the attacking forces. So Mont St. Quentin, one way you think, where are the tanks? Must be tanks everywhere. No tanks. The tanks are not keeping up with the speed of the advance. So something that we associate with 1918, we're very much involved in the actions. Not always. They're not keeping up. So again, we're back down to the infantry and the artillery supporting the infantry. Even the artillery is struggling to keep up in some cases with the speed of the advance. So we're back down to an infantryman in the open who has to make decisions by himself. And we're not even kind of looking at a brigadier or a battalion commander, lieutenant colonel. This is Joe Bloggs Private, who happens to be the only bloke that's on his feet And he can see that if he stands up and keeps moving forward, which he's been ordered to do at this point, he's probably going to get killed and get the blokes that are with him killed. But if he goes to the right and round that rock and round that tree and up that gully, then he will be able to take the position from the side. But in doing so, he's crossing out of his line of attack. He will not hesitate to do that because he knows that his job is to take that ridge, and how he does it is not that important. It's just that at the end he will be up there. So that's part of it. It's men being able to make decisions on the hoof while they're attacking, and that is probably because Australians certainly, I often use a term when I'm guiding, scant regard for authority, which is a little bit harsh, I think. But there was an element of that Australians felt, no, we're here to do a job, and I know how to do this job, and I don't need to be told how to do it. And it meant that Australians, not particularly always by the book, but they do tend to have some success when others perhaps would not, because of that ability to make decisions on the hoof. And that had been there right away from day one. It was not always encouraged, but it was there. And in fact, some cases it was very much discouraged. There had to be an element of discipline, of course, but certainly during attacks, every man had to know. That's the other big change, I suppose, of 1918. And it really starts, I always view, a year earlier at the Battle of Messines, that men were briefed considerably better. Battle of Messines, 1917, 7th of June, and there, before the battle, enormous great models built for men to look down upon the landscape and be briefed by their officers on where they were going. You know, there's so-and-so battalion on the right, so-and-so battalion on the left, there's a bloody great rock there, there's a tree there, there's the ruins of a farm there. You will take that farm and then move 100 yards in front of it. So the men knew exactly what to expect. And remember, a lot of the battles here are half light or complete dark, as La Hamel was, and St. Quentin will be. And so moving in the dark without really knowing what on earth is around you, very dangerous. So model making and the ability of men to make models, something that in my military career, I used to carry a model kit in my bag. And so when you were on exercises and you were tasked to patrol or whatever you were doing, you didn't ever see combat. It's still exactly the same. You pulled out your model kit, you made a little model in the sand or the ground, and you had your little houses and things taken from the Monopoly board, and you showed people exactly what you were going to do. So model making and briefing meant that men now in the attack were by far better able to, when their senior NCOs, when their officers were dead, were able to continue the attack because they knew what was going on. And that's another big change of degree that takes place from 1917 onwards.
Up until that point, Messines was seen as the number one victory, wasn't it? Like that was the greatest Allied victory up until that point of the war, wasn't it?
It was, and there's a lot going on. We won't go into the Battle of Messines unless we're drifting off again. But, but Messines, maybe
another podcast.
very, very, very important. And the model making, that model. I mean, just interestingly, to show how important it was seen, a few years ago, archaeologists working on Salisbury Plain, looking for ancient Celtic, prehistory almost artifacts, came across something that they didn't know what it was as they were peeling the turf off in this area, and think, what is this? We have no idea what it was. And what it was a model. It was one of the models. It was a replica of the model that had been built in France for the Battle of Messines, or in Belgium for the Battle of Messines. And it was reproduced in Britain to brief officers on how to build models. So it was reproduced on Salisbury Plain in the training areas. And at the end, it had just been forgotten and lost and covered over, and it was discovered by archaeologists not looking for that at all, and finding the model. So uncovered, photographed, and then covered back over again. So it just gives you an idea of how important it was, that briefing, that model making, and how it will change warfare in 1918, where the men actually now understand what's going on.
So would you say, Pete, that the men in the trenches, were they tied to their artillery in 1918, or do you see a big change in the way that the artillery was fired and the men aren't as tied to their artillery as they were in the previous 2 years?
The artillery is still really, really important, and I suppose this is the other thing that's changed during the war years, right away from 1914 to 1918, because things just changed beyond description. The artillery in 1914 was loath to fire indirect fire. They weren't really trained well in firing indirect fire. They like to be able to see what they were shooting at. Now that has to change, and will change it dramatically. And one of the big issues that has come about is development of range finding, whether it be by flash spotting or by sound ranging. But also, aerial reconnaissance has changed dramatically as well. So now with that communication with aircraft directly to guns, we can see that, and also just the men on the ground, literally sending out patrols to look at what they're going to be attacking in the future days, weeks, months, and making sure that it's written up very carefully. And with very, very accurate shooting, we no longer feel the necessity to obliterate the landscape before we attack. And of course, that had always been the case. Another Australian action with a prime example, village obliterated, the ridge beyond it obliterated. By the time the troops get there, they're not even quite sure where they are in the half light. The whole place is obliterated. That is now not felt necessary. It's a wastage of effort and manpower, and more importantly, it's a wastage of shells. And so we absolutely ensure now that we are only taking out the targets of opportunity or targets that are seen as crucial to an assault. Very accurate shooting, very well-trained gunners, very good ammunition. Another big improvement. Dodgy ammunition from, if you imagine, we had basically shells being made by the ordnance factories that were very much linked to the government. That's what they did. They had supervisors and checkers and inspectors making sure that everything was being made well. Of course, it's then put out the fuses to any brass foundry who can cast and turn brass is making fuses. But there's not enough inspectors, so we went through a big learning curve of issues with the shells not detonating because of problem with manufacturing. By now we've sorted all that out. Well, most of the fuses are very well made. They're checked regularly. They take out batches to make sure that they work. And so shells are going to detonate. They're going to hit the target that they're being fired at. So gunnery has changed dramatically. The other thing that's changed is we've gone back beyond the First World War into a war of movement again. And so the artillery now is not in fixed positions. The horses are very close to the guns. The guns are not, in most cases, if you look at pictures, certainly of the Australian artillery at this period, they're out in the open, wheel to wheel almost, batteries firing side by side. The key is they're going to fire what they've been given, their targets for that hour, for that day, for that half day, whatever period it is, and then they're going to move. And by the time the Germans have tried to sort out exactly where they are using their reconnaissance, the guns will not be there. So there's no need to build defences to have the ammunition brought up in small numbers, because that's an issue, obviously, with having a lot of ammunition around your gun. If it's hit, then the whole lot goes up. To not even build great shelters for the ammunition, just perhaps a scrape in the earth and store the ammunition there. No great shelters for the men, because they're going to be moving again before they come under counter battery fire. So a big change to the artillery, but they are still, as I said, experiencing the problem of keeping up with the movement of the infantry. But the guns are even better. They've even improved the 18-pounder, the general support weapon for all of the Empire forces. The 18-pounder has now had a new suppressor, that's the technical term, built onto the recoil system. So they're even less bounce. So the guns can fire, they don't move, they don't even have to reset the dial sights, and they can fire their targets and off they go. So big change. So the artillery has changed as well, a mobile war and a war of movement and accurate artillery fire, not a war of total destruction any longer.
For the soldiers on the ground, Pete, the tactics of the bite and hold, is that with the 100-day advance, obviously those tactics would have changed, because you don't want to bite and hold, you want to keep smashing your enemy and pushing them back. So the bite and hold tactics, have they sort of stopped in the lead up to...
No, the bite and hold is still going on. It's a term. It's one of my favourite terms. I don't like the term peaceful penetration. I always find that slightly odd, but yeah. So the bite and hold is still taking place, but it's taking place in the sense that is what we're expected to do. We move forward. We do not fall back. I mean, you have to say that the Americans at this time, remember the Americans are also coming into the war not to a great extent in our sector, even though we will have 3 divisions, and those 3 divisions will support the Australians, perhaps something we'll bring in a second. The Americans were under orders not to withdraw at all, to keep moving with no retreat. But for us, it's not equally the same. We don't try not to retreat. Interestingly, it's one of the periods that you don't expect that we lose people as captured prisoners of war, but we do. Men do overstretch themselves, and with that kind of bite and hold mentality of grabbing a piece of ground and not letting it go, very often they found themselves overstretched if the people to your right and left didn't advance to the same extent. And so we do lose men that captured at this period as well, something that we forget. We just think this is success. Success means we're moving forward. Well, obviously we're not going to lose men, but we do. We have been captured. So people do overstretch themselves. But no, that there is certainly that bite and hold is still there. I think they still use the term at that period, even though it is a general advance. But still, if the advance is not going we always imagine advance in a straight line, and of course that's not the case. We get bulges and ripples, and so people find themselves exposed, but they still try to hold on to what they've taken. Of course, the big thing that is in everybody's minds right the way from the start, from the 8th of August as we kicked off, we knew that at some stage we are going to hit the Hindenburg Line. That heavily defended position only really breached once properly during the Battle of Cambrai in the November of 1917, and that was with the mass use of tanks. So we know that we're going to hit that. The Hindenburg Line is there; it's waiting for us. So there is that in people's minds all the time. The infantrymen's minds is that, oh Christ, that is there. That is at some stage we are going to have to cross both the outpost line, which is in front of the Hindenburg Line, and for the Australians, it's going to be based looking from their attack direction to the left of St. Quentin. So there's the town of St. Quentin, and it's going to involve a canal crossing as well, the St. Quentin Canal. So they've got a few issues to think about, and the men, again, because the briefings are being improved, they would know what was coming, that they were going to hit that Hindenburg Line, and so that is going to be a problem. The key to taking the Hindenburg Line for Australian and everybody at that time was ensuring that you remained in contact with the enemy. Because effectively, this is how the British managed to hold the Germans in their spring offensive, is that if you are in contact with the enemy, then they don't have time to settle, to do anything, to try and dig in. You've got to break contact. Effectively, I use the term jokingly, you've got to run away quicker than the enemy is pushing you back. Of course, in the British Army, we don't like that term, running away. We tend to call it a strategic withdrawal. So you've got to withdraw faster than the enemy is pushing you back, and that time that is created allows you to build defensive positions or to create defensive positions. Well, for the Germans, they're laughing. If they can break contact from us pushing them back in 100 days, then they can then have the time to get behind the Hindenburg Line, to dig in properly, and to wait for us to arrive. So that is really what Monash was pushing for when at Mont St. Quentin he says you've got to take that, I don't care what it takes, it's got to be taken, you've got to keep moving. It's because he's aware that if we're held at Mont St. Quentin, not to be confused with St. Quentin, then the problem is going to be that the Germans will break contact, and they will have that time to reinforce the Hindenburg Line and to ensure that it is fully ready for an assault, which is obviously coming. And that's what happens. We do not break contact or allow them to break contact. And as they fall back into the Hindenburg Line, the outpost positions first, and then the Hindenburg Line, we are in contact with them. We don't allow them to settle. And because of that reason, the Hindenburg Line will collapse. I'm just going to go off onto a subject that is quite interesting.
Yeah, Pete, by
I
all
quite
means.
often I get people that say, what were the Germans like at this period? what is the German morale like? Are they just running away constantly? The minute they see soldiers crest the skyline, are they off? And it's very mixed. It's a very, as it always is in war, it's a very mixed situation. Some German units, we can tell by the records of the battalion records, are surrendering in mass. As we crest the skyline, that's it, they've had enough. They know the war's lost. They know the war's going to finish it within months, probably, and they will surrender. Other units still fight to the last man. So they fight to the last man. The big problem from an infantryman is, as you crest that ridge, which are you going to be facing? Are you going to be facing a group of men who are going to stick their hands up and that's it? Or are you going to be facing fanatics who will fight to the last man? And of course, why they're starting to fight is they are aware that if they do not, we are going into Germany. Now, as it happens, the armistice is going to be signed and that will not happen. But it instills a bit more of a fighting spirit if you think your families are at risk, that we are going to follow their fallback into Germany itself. So it's tough. That at 1918 fighting, it's tough because the men knew that the war was going to end. And that's the fun thing. If you'd have spoken to a soldier in 1916, 1917, could you see an end to the war? No. You couldn't see it. You could not see how this was going to end. The 100 days, you most definitely can see how it's going to end. And that is one of the things that I think is so hard on the men that are fighting in this 100 days, is they can see an end. Oh my God, I'm going to survive the war in 1914, 1918. I am going to make it to the end. Well, actually, maybe I'm not, because they're asking me to attack this position tomorrow. Why are we doing it? The Germans surely are going to keep falling back and there's going to be an armistice. But soldiers, we need to keep the pressure on. We need to get through the Hindenburg line. So it meant that those men had to grit their teeth, and that's why I look upon the 1918 soldier fighting in the 100 days is a man that I think you have to have a great admiration for, because those men are gritting their teeth. They're getting on with the job, but in their heart of hearts, they're feeling, I'm not sure I really need to be doing this. And that is a really hard thing to ask a soldier to do, to continue doing something that he's become good at, that this is his profession, but one that he's now no longer sure that it's necessary. And of course, we will fight to the wire. We fight right to the wire. Americans also. 11th November, they are literally fighting up till 11 o'clock. And so a lot of men lost in those final few hours. But at this point, still months away from the end, and they are having to work very hard. A final thing to say about the men and the style of men that are fighting there, of course, what we have is another issue, Gallipoli. Gallipoli is already the first Anzac Day, 1916, so the year after it is something that has grown and grown during the war. So here we are, 1918, and soldiers that fought at Anzac Cove, so soldiers that fought on the Gallipoli Peninsula, they are starting to be revered. They're even wearing that A on their arms, on their colour patch, their battalion colour patch. Every battalion a separate colour patch. They have that A on their arms, and we can see them. They didn't have to wear it, just need to point that out. It was up to them whether they wore that A, but if you were at Anzac Cove and fought on the peninsula, you were entitled to wear a brass A on your arm. Those men are being watched. You can imagine, because we are still getting new recruits coming in, and they see a bloke with an A on his arm. He's still a private, but watch him, keep an eye on him. Look, he's survived this long. I have to say, a lot of men don't like being followed in combat, especially if you've got no rank. And so that's why a lot of A's were not worn during combat, because the men became aware that those who had recently arrived would follow them, because they think they knew what they were doing, because they'd survived until 1918 from 1915. So it wasn't enforced, but certainly a lot of guys did wear them. And the casualties of those guys wearing those brasses if they wanted to, but they said the Anzacs is very high. The reason being, of course, if you are still there from 1915 to 1918 and you've wanted promotion, then you are the guys that are going to be leading from the front. You are going to be the lieutenants, the captains, the senior NCOs, the sergeant majors, the RSMs. a lot of them are Gallipoli men, and of course they are expected to lead from the front, and so they become casualties. So we are starting to lose an awful lot of Gallipoli men in this last 100 days as we fight towards the Hindenburg line and just beyond it. And it became so serious that when Australian troops were withdrawn on the 6th of October from the line for reorganisation, don't think they're being withdrawn and no, we can have a rest. That wasn't the case. It just happens that during that reorganisational process, the armistice will be signed, so they will not go back into the line. But also during that period, they actually started sending the Gallipoli men home. It was felt that they needed a proper break. They needed some home leave. Of course, the British soldiers needed to get home leave. I always make a little point here. There was a very big process going on in Britain to try and give some home comforts to colonial soldiers that were a long, long way from home. And it was almost like an adopt an Australian situation going on, that families very often, and certainly families that had sons perhaps who were serving and may possibly sadly have been killed, they tended to adopt Australian soldiers who would actually then have places to go to for those that didn't have relatives in Britain to go visit. Of course, many Australian soldiers did have relatives to go and visit in Britain, and another little point, about 20% of the AIF was actually formed from men who would, straight speaking, they're not quite Australians. They are men who may have become, if they survive, or if they survived, or if they go back to Australia, will become Australians. But at that point, they would probably see themselves, I always like to think that they would see themselves as men of the empire. Men who are travelling around the empire and just happen to be in Australia when the war broke out. So about 20% are fairly recent arrivals. Perhaps the most famous being that man and his donkey, who was a fairly recent arrival to Australia when the war broke out. The Australian soldier of 1918 in that 100 days, I always view as being tough, being experienced in the main. These are very broad brush, of course. Being tough, being experienced, and doing his duty, but with an eye on the end, knowing that the end is not far away. I'm sure you were going to ask me, Adam, about some of the problems they had with Australian troops in 1918. There were a few issues, especially in the period just as they were drawn from the line on the 9th of October. Just before that is Australian soldiers were getting a little uppity, but for a very odd reason. And that was that because of the manpower issues, it was Monash decided that it would have to disband some of the battalions, and the men would have to be allocated to other battalions. And of course, this didn't go down well. These guys had fought, in some cases, all the way with their battalions from the Gallipoli Peninsula, and to be disbanded in the months of the war, and they would not know that, but that's the case, to be disbanded was just something unthinkable to them. That colour patch they wore on their arms. And so several battalions refused. They refused to disband. Monash was very clever. He actually decided that another option would be to amalgamate. And that would mean that a new battalion made out of 2 battalions, but keeping all its traditions and their colour patches was seen as acceptable to some he didn't disband. The 21st Battalion was one that mutinied, a term that we don't use very often, but they mutinied. They refused to disband, and so it's classed as a mutiny. A very strange mutiny, a mutiny of men that refused to leave. The officers felt they could not be involved, and so the men just elected their own replacement officers and said, right, you can be the officer today, and we'll carry on doing our training program, and that's exactly what they did. So it's a great story, and shows the esprit de corps and how proud they were of their battalion records by the time we get to 1980.
Pete, it's just like just sitting here listening, like that's something I didn't know, that they just amalgamated the battalions. I've read that they talking of disbanding battalions because of the losses and obviously the recruitment of the of the men from Australia had slowed in 1918. But that's something new that I didn't know myself. And mate, it's really you can see how desperate the situation was for the troops at the front. And Monash he should face some criticism here, because he was pushing the men a lot harder than what they probably should have been pushed, and he almost did push them to breaking point, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean there's a lot, and there has been in the last few years, because of course the centenaries, a lot written about Monash, and I'm decided to be truthful. I haven't read enough books about him, because there are some very good books, and some are on my bookshelves, but I've not yet had time to read them. But certainly Monash is we perceive him now as a great figure. I'm not saying he wasn't. He certainly alters warfare. He's one of those that's very crucial or key to that change in tactics, which will eventually lead us to what we now would know as the all arms attack: the aircraft, the tanks, the guns, the infantry, all knowing what each other are doing. So he's crucial to that, among others. But he's certainly not standalone. He certainly is not what we sometimes perceive, and we can see that from the fighting at Mont St. Quentin. I have had some of my clients who are saying he was so careful with his men. Well, he wasn't. It's like all commanders. If you're given a job to do, and you have to, I think we have to also put him in his place. He is still only a corps commander. He's commanding the Australian Corps. That's right. As far as seniority is concerned, he's not that bigger in the broader picture of the 60 plus divisions that are on the Western Front. And so that's the other thing we have to think of. That's just the British, 60 British divisions or thereabouts on the Western Front. Australia only 5. Now I'm not demeaning Australian effort. It's a phenomenal effort for the men, the number of men in Australia, the number of people, the population. It's all about population. So enormous effort from Australia, especially an effort that doesn't involve conscription. But certainly back to Monash. Monash himself, he's a driven man. He's a very much a driven man. I know in recent years Tim Fisher, no longer with us, very much a very, very keen supporter. I've got his book on the bookshelves. I don't think a particularly good book. I have to say I've only skimmed through it because he is such a fan of Monash that he was involved in leading a campaign to have Monash awarded a Field Marshal's baton. It would be unusual. A man of the rank of Monash at the end of the war, did they all get Field Marshal's baton? No, they didn't. So, it would be unusual, and certainly to retrospectively award a Field Marshal's baton, I think was nonsensical, and I'm very pleased it didn't happen. Whether you believe he should have had one or not, I think is irrelevant. I don't like us tinkering with history. I think it's important that history is left for us to assess it without going back and tweaking it.
Exactly right.
So I was pleased that didn't happen. But I think Monash was certainly wasn't liked. One of the things by an awful lot of people, we can look at people's personal papers from that period, and we realise that a lot of people really didn't like him. Now, you have to say, is there an element of, because I'm sure there wasn't aware he was Jewish, is there an element of anti-Semitism there? Perhaps there is, but I think there's a lot of people who just didn't feel that, I think perhaps felt that he did push too hard, but he was pushed too hard, and was he pushing hard because it was for him, because he wanted to be remembered? Interestingly, at the end of the war, one of the big worries for a lot of politicians certainly was that he would go into politics, and he was advised and did not go into politics, and I think that was also a worry from some people who would be concerned that if he entered politics he could do very well, but no, he didn't go into politics. I don't want to go into a Monash talk because I'm sure that's a podcast for later.
It is, yes, but I think you're right, Pete. We have to touch on him a little bit, and speaking of 1918 and with the AIF, and I'm not, as I said, I agree with you. I'm not taking anything away from what Monash achieved and what he did.
Certainly not. I mean, I always make a comment when I'm guiding it, and we're talking about the tactics. Is myself as an ex-Marine, my tactics that I would be taught as a junior NCO would be the tactics that Monash really developed, and others, but the ones that he put into practice.
That's right.
Hamel, putting the machine guns off to the flank, advancing in small rushes, moving forward with cover of darkness, overhead fire from heavy machine guns and artillery. It's the stuff that I was taught in the 80s. It's the stuff that my son, who also served in the Marines, was taught 5 years ago. It is still infantry tactics in the advance. Basically, we are doing with variations what Monash was doing at the Battle of Mobrahan. So he's an important character in bringing those all-arms attacks into play. Thankfully, now of course we have personal radios, which are a vast improvement. Even in my day, a lot of shouting took place on the battlefield. Communication was very difficult.
I couldn't agree more, and like we said, he's definitely a controversial figure, and he should be granted respect, but also too, he has to face some criticism. It's just part and parcel of the job. It's
history. It's history.
Exactly right.
Look at people, don't we?
It's the same as General Haig. He is the most controversial figure of World War One. Like, there's so many things said about that he was a butcher, but as I often say to people, Haig's job, he had 5 armies. He's another level above what Monash was, and
yeah. And I think an interview with Peter Hart would go down well on Haig, because he was a big supporter of yeah.
I think yes, I think that's right, but it's something that has to be touched on, and so getting to the closing stages of the war, and we lead into obviously after St. Quentin and Peronne, and we move. What was where were the Anzacs? Where were they off to after that?
Excuse me, sorry.
You're right.
So we have to get through the Hindenburg outpost line. And then we have to cross the canal, and we cross the canal at a place called there's 2 places, Bellaglis and Bellicourt, which are very close to each other, relatively speaking, on the canal. And so it's a case of fighting through there. What did the Hindenburg line consist of? A lot of people kind of very often, when we're visiting it on tour, are expecting it to look something like the Atlantic Wall, or perhaps the Maginot Line, or something like that. Where's all the concrete? Well, there's not very, very little left of the Hindenburg Line, because there was not a lot of concrete holes, a lot of underground positions, which are no longer visible. It was masses of barbed wire, and perhaps that's one of the big problems that they have to face, but thankfully tanks are very good at getting rid of barbed wire. But it's masses of barbed wire, it's underground positions, it's concealed gun positions, and the villages all being fortified. But effectively, once we were through the Hindenburg line, and for Australia, a big effort needed, a big effort. And once we were through it and back out into the open, we are actually then, for the first time, we are hitting a countryside that has not been devastated. And you have to remember that was a very unusual circumstance for soldiers who've been fighting on the Western Front since 1915 onwards. They were fairly much fixed positions, devastation. When you advanced over an area that had been shelled out of existence. So here we are beyond the fighting of 1916, 1917, and we are into an open landscape. And it is. I often look at the American TV series Band of Brothers, which covers the Americans right away from Normandy right the way up into Germany, crossing the countryside. And this is what the type of landscape they're looking at. Shelled, yes, we would shell a village before we would move forward, but it would not be devastated around. We would take out the crossroads, perhaps take out an edge of a wood. But this is a landscape where they are literally ducking and diving behind hedges, behind trees, behind walls. So it's an advance that a soldier fighting in 1944 through France would have certainly recognised. And the tactics would not have been dissimilar. Call up the artillery when you find a problem, call up the tanks, call in the aircraft, something that we haven't really covered much. I mentioned them very briefly in talking about the fact that they were being used for communication. But of course, what they're also now being used for is ground strafing and bombing. And not strategic bombing as in flying very high and dropping bombs on a town, which the Germans had been doing in London in 1917. What we are doing is ground strafing. We are sending the dive bombers, effectively. We are sending planes to attack specific targets and to take them out with machine gun fire and bombs. So things have changed completely. And it is literally, it's beyond the Hindenburg line. Australian troops, their front line is about 20 kilometres, not even 20, 10 kilometres beyond the Hindenburg line is where their final fighting will take place. Again, once the soldiers knew, as we approached the 6th of October, once they knew they were going to be withdrawn, there was a lot of complaints as why should we be sent into action when we know we're being withdrawn the following day. Well, of course, without being cruel, it doesn't matter. The war doesn't end when they were withdrawn, so they are expected to do their job up until that hour when they're withdrawn from the line. So we do see heavy casualties in the final hours of the Australian experience. And in fact, it's a pioneer battalion. I forget which one it is. But pioneer battalion, of course, is something that is probably for a podcast later. The pioneer battalions, normally used for labouring in the front line, have now been given their rifles because there is no labouring in the front line because there is no front line in that sense, and they are back to a traditional role of infantry. And so one of the last units to go into battle is one of the pioneer battalions. I forget which one it was. Each division has so it's between 1 and 5. But it went, I've got a feeling it might be the 4th, but I'm not sure. So you'll have to go and have a read of a book to find out which one.
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head either, Pete. I know I'd have to look it up myself. I'd have to look
I find the Pioneer Battalions, going off on a tangent again, the Pioneer Battalions I think are very interesting, and certainly I've been doing a little bit of research on the Pioneer Battalions and how often they were literally tasked to pick up their rifles and to go into the assaults, and it's surprisingly not often.
Yeah.
To the extent that in 1918 some of the Pioneer Battalions had never seen combat in that sense. They'd perhaps done a bit of defensive work where they had to pick up their rifles to fire, but very few had been actually tasked to actually advance and to take an enemy position, and it was something that they found quite hard going. So Pioneer Battalion, something well worth doing a bit more research on.
That's the best thing about having a chat. It leads. There's so many avenues that you can go down, and you could do a podcast.
Tangents.
Yeah, tangents. It's great, and
my favourite word.
And it's a great word, Pete. It really is. It's great to. It's talking about history. It's great, and probably a topic and with the tangents, it's topics that aren't covered a lot, and it's great to actually touch on them and give them a voice, really.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, there's so many aspects of the Great War. I mean, we touched upon so many different things just in our talk that you could take a lot further. And that's, I think, one of the great joys of doing research on the Great War is there's always something new to have a look at and to wonder, how did that work? What happened there? How was that used?
Absolutely.
I mean, we haven't talked a lot about the weaponry.
No.
Because that's the other thing. The soldiers, the infantrymen's weaponry has improved considerably since the early days, and you'd have to say that the last 100 days is where the Lewis gun comes into its own as an infantry support weapon. So perhaps say that for another day. The weapon.
I think it's definitely something to touch on in another podcast. That's for sure. And the last battle for Australia before they were withdrawn to rest. That was the Battle of Mobrahan. So what was the fighting there? Why were we at Mobrahan?
Yeah, Mobrahan is just, if you imagine that from Villers-Bretonneux, if you were to draw a straight line with a little bit of wobble, but a straight line going due east, that is where the Australian soldiers, that was their task. And the task of all 5 divisions was to follow that straight line going due east and to force the Germans back. So Mobrahan is just a village. It is a fairly large village. It's not a small village. So population, I'm trying to think, my village where I live is a population of 200 people, so probably about 400 to 600 people originally would have been in the village. Gives you an idea of the number of houses that would have been there.
Yep.
It is just a village that the Germans had fortified. We are now beyond the Hindenburg line. And it is just a case of that's where the Australian troops were as we approached that 6th of October, and their final task was to take that village. So that village had to be taken. There's a very, very beautiful little cemetery on the outskirts of the village, one that when we're covering that area I try to go to. And it's interesting to look at the men that are buried in there and to have a look at how many of them started their journey on the Gallipoli Peninsula and sadly did not get through that final day's fighting around the village. It's the village was very knocked about by the end of the fighting, but it's an area where you can still go and you can see buildings that have bullet hits around the windows and shell pot marking in them. Whereas here, where I live, nothing, because this village was completely reconstructed by 1927. My house is emblazoned with the date 1927.
Wow.
When it was completed, as are several others, because there is nothing beyond the 1920s. There's no relics of the war we can look at because everything was destroyed. So that's why it's interesting to go to those areas around Mobrahan, because we actually can see a little bit more of what took place, as well as the cemeteries and the memorials. And of course, that's one of the sadder aspects is for those people that come to the Western Front expecting to see great fortifications and things. There isn't really anything, because the majority of it was obliterated during the fighting, or this effort that the French put into trying to put their country back as it had been. It was an obsession with the French. They wanted, and the Belgians to a certain extent, they wanted this country back as it had been, as if the Germans had never come here. So everything was put back as it had been, and everything that had been built by the Germans was removed. So there's not a lot literally of the fortifications, and also because, as I said, the Hindenburg Line was not a great fortification, as in with lots of concrete poured. It was underground positions and lots of barbed wire, and so once the barbed wire's gone, then it's gone. Having said that, the remnants are in the fields here everywhere. So I'm in lockdown at the moment, as we all are.
Yep.
I can walk my 1K from my house, and I can walk into the fields, and I can come back with handfuls of shrapnel balls because they're everywhere, if nothing else.
Pete, do a lot of it, like obviously Mobrahan, do a lot of Australians get out to that part of the battlefield, or is it a
no,
less?
No, they don't. It's one of the interesting aspects of, I suppose, of battlefield tourism and visiting pilgrims. It is not an easy place to get to, in the sense that it doesn't go well with a journey. If you're doing a journey that may start in Paris, it may start in Amiens, wherever it starts. Getting out there is a little bit further afield and following the natural Western Front line, which will eventually take you to Ypres. So, interestingly, one of the divisions decided to place its memorial in that area, the 4th Division. And so the 4th Divisional Memorial, overlooking the St. Quentin Canal and the final fighting of the 4th Division, is the least visited divisional memorial. And in fact, where I may visit the 5th Division Memorial perhaps 50, 60, 70 times in a year, depending on the number of tours I have, the 5th Divisional Memorial being at Polygon Wood, the 4th Divisional Memorial perhaps 3 or 4 times a year.
Wow.
So it shows you, and generally speaking, if I'm out that way, it is because somebody has a relative and has come on a very specific individual tour and wants to visit the relative and know the story of the crossing of the Hindenburg Line.
Yep.
Of course, we do talk about the Hindenburg Line, but not at that period. We talk about it in 1917 and the fighting around Bullecourt, or Bullecourt, as perhaps you may pronounce it. But Bullecourt is unsuccessful fighting the Hindenburg Line. Yes, we do capture a section of the trench, but nothing else, or a section of the line, but very little else other than that. But that's where we will potentially talk about the Hindenburg Line on the tour. But I would recommend for anybody that is very interested or is interested in the Hindenburg Line and the fighting of 1918 to make the effort to head out towards St. Quentin and to have a look at the trench, where the trench lines used to be, and the canal. The canal is still in exactly the same spot, so it's not very often you can position things perfectly because of the canal being.
Absolutely. Well, it's a part of the battlefield that, like, I've been over myself 3 times, and I haven't been myself to the 1918 battle, or most of the 1918 battles myself, and it's definitely in the future. Once we can get back over, Pete, I'd actually like to go and walk it with you and.
Well, next time we will do, Adam. Next time you're over, we'll go and spend some time up there and we'll have a look. It is interesting.
It is. It's a part of, because there's so much going on in 1918, it's not a real area that's looked over a lot. It's brushed over very quickly because you've got the Australians pull out on the 6th, and then obviously the armistice, and you don't, the whole end of the First World War really is, it's sort of brushed over really quick. It doesn't...
It is. I have to agree entirely, and really we have to say until books were written in the last 10 years, and again I'll mention it again because it's such a good book, Peter Hart's book on the 100 Days. It was almost seen as, well, 8th of August was the Black Day, and then the war finished on the 11th of November. It was almost, that was it. It was so easy, from the 8th of August, the Black Day for Germans, off we went, 100 days fighting, the war ends. And that is actually how it was treated. I have to say, even myself, as a young man growing up, it was the Somme, it was Passchendaele, it was the Mons, the first actions, but nobody really talked about the ending of the war, other than it finished on the 11th of November, and on the 8th of August it had been a great day, and we carried on, and then it finished. And you're right, it's only in recent years, and now on my bookshelves I have a good handful of books that are very, very well written on that final 100 days. So it is an area that is still forgotten about, but at least now we can read books on it as well as this. So yeah, it's a great area to go because of the tactics, because of the changing tactics, absolutely. And it does complement, because so many people do believe that 1914, the whistles blew, we stood up and we walked against machine guns, and they kind of get that. I talk to people over and over again who think we were still doing that in 1918. It's just that the Germans had run out of men and we were. But we're still using the same tactics, and you couldn't be farther from the truth.
Absolutely.
So when they're fighting at the start of the war and they're fighting at the end, it is a different type of army company.
Well, most people that I talk to, or that you speak to of the First World War, Pete, they pretty much say, oh, well, it was old school generals leading men to just chew barbed wire and just get slaughtered in fields, and they couldn't be further from the truth, because obviously the war advanced in the 4 years of the war. It advanced so much from 1914 to 1918, and that's why it's such a great war to study, because it was a war that had never been fought before. Like, generals had never seen a war that was like the tactics had changed. Yes, in 1914, as you said, whistle blow, men go over, generally they get killed. And in 1918, there's tanks, planes, everything. It all changes.
Yeah. Oh, it is a complete crucible of throwing everything we can into it, and of course the big issue is that, and the problem is, one of the things that people say, well, when we invented the tank, surely that should have been it, but there's a counter. As soon as we invent something, the Germans will invent something to counter it. As soon as the Germans invent something, we invent something to counter it. So there is never going to be that enormous breakthrough that we had always hoped for, and it becomes a slogging match where we have to change tactics. It's like two boxers facing each other and trying to find an opening that will give them that advantage. And you have to say, we were both nearly on our knees at the end of the war. Both, I mean, the Empire forces, I mean, the French, I mean, everybody. We were all nearly on our knees.
Absolutely. And, well, there was a real thought that the war would go into 1919, and it was just purely from the hard fighting, not just from the Australians, from everyone, there's the myth that the Germans were stabbed in the back, but they were soundly defeated, weren't they, on the battlefield? Like, they were smashed.
Oh, they were. I mean, they were being smashed on the Western Front, but I think we have to remember that there were issues at home, big issues at home. Starvation being the major one, because the other reason they were being smashed is because the German U-boat problem had been sorted out by then, effectively. And the U-boat problem, I mean, one of the interesting aspects is that the German soldiers, for all of 1918, were going hungry. They were struggling. And one of the things that was a massive morale blow to the German army was during that successful advance, when they broke through and the spring offensive, starting on the 21st of March, they hit supply depots, and discovered chocolate and beer and bully beef and great depots full of it. And they hadn't done anything like that for years because the blockade had stopped any foodstuffs being brought in, had stopped having problems with metals, just everything. And so to realise that we had all of this stuff, and of course a lot of it coming from America eventually, was just one of the final nails in the coffin for the Germans. Knew that they would not win the war. And so the German army, as I said earlier, still fighting on, but knowing what was going on at home and the navy mutinying, etc., were problems. And I'm sure there were men that would have fought on. And of course, the German army. It's one of the strange aspects, isn't it, of the end of the war? Really, is what happened on that 11th of November, and we're drifting off what we'll talk about, but it's just interesting. What happened on the 11th of November when the two armies they're facing each other? Thankfully, the Australians not in a line any longer, but let's say you're a Canadian or a Brit, and what happened on the 11th of November? What literally happened? Well, the German army the following day stood up, waved, and said, "We're off. We'll see you then." And they hitched up their rifles and their guns and they headed home.
Oh wow!
It is a very, very odd end to a war. Normally we round everybody up, we put them in prison camps, and we sort them out. And no, the German army went home into a civil war. It was a very, very strange time for the Germans as a nation.
And I guess, Pete, in a way, it's really a gentlemanly way to finish the war, I guess. After so much sacrifice, it was really a gentleman way to pack up and...
we have to say it's a very odd ending, and I think the soldiers were the people that found it the strangest. Yes, parties in Paris, parties in London, parties in Brisbane, parties in Melbourne, there was mass rejoicing everywhere that we'd eventually been successful and beaten the Germans. But for the frontline infantryman, he sat there in his trench and thought, what am I going to do now? No, he literally did. You do not hear about parties in the front line or anywhere near where the frontline troops were. In fact, my overall comment is always that Jim turned to Fred and said, "Put the kettle on." Because what else did you do?
Well, exactly right.
They had no idea what to do. It was I think a joyous time for many, but for the frontline soldier, it was I don't quite understand what's going on here. This is not what am I going to do now?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And I read an account a little while ago that most of the men, they didn't actually believe that the war was over. They actually thought it was. They didn't believe that the order had come, that the war had finished.
Yeah, I'm sure there were many different experiences around. I think a lot of guys did know. I think a lot of guys knew very, very, very well. Whether they believed it or not is another matter.
Yeah.
But certainly it was no surprise. It had been looming for quite some time, and most units were very much aware. And I think that's what makes it hard work. For those units that had to fight up to the wire on the 11th,
yeah.
To know that it's ending tomorrow, that at 11 o'clock the guns are going to stop firing, and yet you're asking me to advance over that river terrible. Just heartbreaking for those families who thought that their relatives had made it and then got that information beyond the end of the war that their relatives had died in the last hours or days.
Yeah, and really you have to think, Pete, they knew the armistice was coming, and being forced to take something that wouldn't matter the next day. Absolutely. It's just and you think in a way, Pete, pointless. Like pointless comes to mind. Pointless death, really, that shouldn't have happened. But that's why you and I love studying the First World War, because these stories need to be told. And Pete, I think it's a great note to end on the show. I really think it's been fantastic, and it's been a real interesting topic, and I'm really glad that I got you on. And mate, we definitely love to have you back on the show, and hopefully it's been enjoyable for you as well.
Yeah, no, great fun.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast.